He poisoned his co-workers there.
He's vowed to preserve and protect and provide the necessary means to sustain life. And here's this guy looking at that oath and just, basically burning it.
He violated not only the trust of the patients, but the trust of his co-workers. He's a sick individual.
Why? Why would you do this? What motivated you to hurt and kill people?
According to research by Johns Hopkins University, an estimated 250,000 people die from medical errors each year, making it the third leading cause of death in the US. Amidst these errors, one name stands out in horror: Dr. Michael Swango, a physician who became the embodiment of every patient's worst nightmare. You might think that in the hands of a trusted doctor, lives are saved. But what if those hands are tainted with malice? Who then is safe?
He grew up in Quincy. In 1984, he poisoned his co-workers there. In 1985, it's where a judge sentenced him to 5 years in prison. Michael Swango's story began right here in the Tri-States, but few could have ever guessed where it would end.
Joseph Michael Swango was born on 21st of October, 1954, in a small village of Lewis, Washington. Right from his early years, he had a keen interest in anything relating to medicine, quite the noble ambition for a 10-year-old. His mother, Muriel Swango, was a housekeeper, and his father, John, was a strict military official who raised him in a similar pattern, and it would later reflect in Michael's academic and professional ambitions. But behind this supposed disciplinary upbringing was the making of a disastrous mind, waiting to unleash terror on the medical world. After several years of moving from base to base, the family came to settle in Quincy in 1967. But his father abandoned his family following the 1975 fall of Saigon, became a chronic alcoholic, and died in 1982. Michael's childhood appeared ordinary, almost idyllic. Despite his father's estrangement, he seemed to thrive. A soft-spoken young man, he displayed an intense focus on academic excellence at Quincy's Notre Dame High School. He was a top student, class officer, and a member of the student council. This earned him a scholarship to Millikan University in Illinois. However, after 2 years, he abruptly left Millikan and joined the Marines. The military, though prestigious, wasn't a perfect fit. So after another 2 years, he received an honorable discharge as a sergeant. But it became clear that the military hadn't given him the fulfillment he sought. Returning home, Michael decided to refocus on academics. This time, he aimed higher, enrolling at Quincy University to study medicine. His academic prowess returned, and he graduated in 1979 with an impressive 3.89 GPA. By then, at 23, his future seemed limitless, but beneath the surface, darkness was brewing. At 24, Swango entered Southern Illinois University Medical School, poised to achieve his dream of becoming a doctor. His credentials as a promising medical student began to solidify. But this was the turning point. What looked like the beginning of a promising career was, in fact, the start of something far more sinister. The man who once seemed like an overachiever would soon embark on a terrifying path, one that would leave a trail of devastation in its wake. Several of Michael Swango's classmates described him as intelligent, but there were subtle red flags that hinted at something far more disturbing. He kept a gruesome scrapbook filled with images of fatal car accidents, and he had a disturbing fascination with death, often steering conversations toward morbid topics. His interest in disaster and crime cases far outweighed his focus on conventional medical studies, a choice that unnerved those around him. To his peers, Swango was a quiet, withdrawn student, but he was also seen as a gunner, a student who would cheat, manipulate, and do whatever it took to get ahead. His methods were unconventional and unethical, and his frequent absences from medical classes due to a part-time job severely impacted his practical skills. According to his classmates, his work was often sloppy and careless, raising concerns among those who worked alongside him. One classmate would later recall Swango as someone who was immoral to the point of being psychopathic. Swango's reputation among his peers earned him the nickname 00 Swango, a sinister play on the License to Kill moniker made famous by James Bond. This was no exaggeration. On more than one occasion, Swango reported that a patient was improving, only for the same patient to mysteriously die or suffer severe complications shortly after. These incidents left his classmates deeply unsettled and raised questions about his intentions. By his third year, Swango's incompetence and unsettling behavior had drawn the attention of his supervisors. His practical failures and questionable ethics made it clear that something was seriously wrong, and the medical school administration grew increasingly concerned. Little did they know, the worst was yet to come. Reports began to surface of Swango repeatedly falsifying patient logs and forging medical documents, serious offenses that could have warranted his immediate expulsion from medical school after failing several crucial subjects, including obstetrics and gynecology. A committee was convened to investigate his academic performance. During the inquiry, a resident practitioner revealed a troubling incident where Swango completed a patient's report without ever examining the patient. Despite the mounting evidence, he denied the allegations, even when it was confirmed that he had indeed neglected to visit the patient. These violations, among others, were cited as sufficient grounds for his dismissal. The administration faced a difficult decision. Swango was only a month away from graduation, but his unethical conduct and academic failures could not be ignored. When the committee reached a verdict, 8 members voted to expel him. However, one dissenting voice, pathologist John Murphy, one of Swango's instructors, advocated for giving him a second chance. Years later, Murphy would express deep regret over that decision. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Swango was still allowed to graduate from Southern Illinois University Medical School. Shortly after, in 1983, he began an internship at the Ohio State University Medical Center, a decision that marked the beginning of a horrifying chapter in medical history. From the onset of his internship, he became embroiled in a series of medical scandals and controversies. The health of numerous patients under his care began to inexplicably deteriorate, and one patient, who had been recovering well from surgery, died under mysterious circumstances. Nurses started to notice a terrifying pattern that whenever he was on duty, patients seemed to die without any clear cause. This alarming trend was only the beginning of a deadly spree that would claim many lives across different hospitals. Although there were rumors of suspicion about his practice, the hospital didn't stake much into it and thought it not necessary to launch a full-scale inquiry into his background. Swango's tenure at Ohio State continued to be a stalk of nightmares for both patients and fellow workers. Though he wasn't formally convicted during this time, the number of patients dying unexplainably under his care was beginning to raise eyebrows. Nurses were afraid of working with him. In several instances, patients would go into cardiac arrest and unexpected heart failures after routine procedures. And as suspected, the last person to have interacted with them was Swango. These chain of events were too alarming, so the hospital had to look into his application. His acceptance into the university's neurosurgery program had been conditional, a 5-year appointment that depended on his successful completion of a 1-year general surgery internship. But by early spring 1984, just a year into his internship, Swango received a letter from the university notifying him that his appointment had been terminated. No explanation was provided. Swango was quietly asked to leave, without any formal charges, despite a string of suspicious deaths under his watch. Though no charges were brought, the damage was done. The university had unknowingly set the stage for a dangerous career, one that would leave a trail of calamity. Swango, with a knack for deception, quickly moved on. This tendency mirrored his father's nomadic military lifestyle, constantly shifting from one city to another during Swango's youth. This upbringing perhaps influenced his ability to falsify documents and forge references as he sought employment at various hospitals. His Southern Illinois classmates had been right all along. Swango would do anything to stay ahead. His next stop was Quincy, where he managed to secure a side job as a paramedic with the Adams County Ambulance Service. His transition into the role was smooth on paper, but those who had previously worked with him were uneasy. Among the paramedics were Brent Unmissig and Mark Krzysztofczyk, both of whom had encountered Swango during their time in college and medical school. They couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The unease surrounding Swango wasn't just based on rumor, because it was rooted in their experiences of him as someone untrustworthy and possibly dangerous. Despite their reservations, Swango continued working. With his dark ambitions intact and his history of suspicious behavior hidden behind layers of forged documents and manipulation, he was on the move again, but the pattern of death and deception was only just beginning to unfold. Swango thrived in highly stressful situations and was able to draw the admiration of supervisors. He possessed the uncanny ability to appeal to patients and doctors alike. Many times, he was often very eager to work long hours on end in the ambulance and was repeatedly seen at accident and crime scenes even when he was not on duty. But to his colleagues, he was the eccentric paramedic who seemed more excited about the chaos of emergencies than he was concerned about saving lives. He showed up at accident scenes because he had a strange interest in taking photographs and notes of victims inside the crashed vehicles, some of whom were still struggling for their lives.
They were talking about a call that they had in the middle of the night. And it was, I think, a one-vehicle accident. They arrive on scene only to see Swango on top of the roof of the car in plain clothes. He starts firing off pictures. He had pictures of the individuals in that car.
Swango's sinister behavior went beyond the scope of medical practice. He had developed a tradition of poisoning his co-workers. One very notorious case happened in 1984, where he poisoned 4 ambulance paramedics who worked with him. These men had been running a full day's shift, often sleeping and eating in quarters at the Blessing Hospital in Quincy. That morning, he had arrived at the quarters carrying a leathered box stuffed with donuts for the guys. They were happy at the kind gesture, having had very little food to eat all through the shift. They all dug in, except Swango, who stood away, looking and calculating the time it would take for the effect to kick in. About 30 minutes later, one of the paramedics said he felt dizzy and nauseated. He soon got up and left the room, later to be seen vomiting in the toilet. It took another 15 minutes for the remaining 3 to experience the same symptoms.
I'd say about 20 minutes later, I'm just starting to get a little nauseated and my stomach's starting to turn. I didn't say anything and I'm dripping wet, pale. I kind of felt like I was dying.
One of them, Brent Unmissig, once recalled asking him jokingly if he had planned to poison them with the donuts. Normally, he denied in response and shook his head. He later left the room with the box containing the rest of the donuts. All 4 men came down with intense vomiting, stomach ache with some frequently collapsing so much that they were excused from work. It was only after a sample of the beverage kept by one of them was taken to the lab that the man's evil intentions were confirmed. There were traces of arsenic found in it, but this was only the beginning of what his eccentric mind was capable of.
But it's hard to make a diagnosis of really what is arsenic poisoning because the symptoms are so non-specific. I mean, you start looking at the symptoms, stomach cramps, you can have problems swallowing, you can get this bizarre metallic taste in your mouth, excess saliva production, again, all non-specific, garlic breath, blood in your urine, cramping muscles, you mentioned the hair loss, excessive sweating, very non-specific, diarrhea, problems with vomiting. And of course, if you get to the point where you're so full of poison, you can have convulsions that can lead to death.
But was Swango ever caught and made to face the law? What about the medical license he had applied for? Was he ever going to change, or did he launch into the practice as a full-blown terror in surgical masks?
He's vowed to preserve and protect and provide the necessary means to sustain life. And here's this guy looking at that oath and just, basically burning it.
He violated not only the trust of the patients, but the trust of his co-workers, certainly.
30 years later, those whom Swango used in his games look back on the man they once called a coworker.
I suppose I was asked why. Because there has to be a reason to do things like this.
I don't think there's ill will. I certainly believe that he's a sick individual, and that he does not have the ability to comprehend what he did.
Well, before his dismissal from Ohio State University, Swango had already been on thin ice. After many warnings from Ohio State University officials regarding the state of his unsatisfactory performance, the hospital experienced a dreadful rise in mysterious deaths and near fatalities in the days and weeks that followed. One particular incident took place on the evening of January 14th when he went to take a blood sample from a young woman named Cynthia Ann McGee, who had been moved to the hospital from another state. She was biking at the University of Illinois when a car knocked her down. At the hospital, at approximately 30 minutes after Dr. Swango left the room at midnight, McGee was pronounced dead, with autopsy attributing the cause of death to early-stage pneumonia, which led to a cardiopulmonary arrest. About 6 days afterward, a team of physicians was doing a routine check at about 6 p.m. on multiple patients in a general ward. Among these patients was 21-year-old Richard DeLong, an accident victim who was in a coma but was recently moved out of the ICU as his condition was improving. He had been receiving oxygen through a tracheostomy tube and was resting comfortably when a respiratory therapist last checked on him just an hour before. Then Swango strolled over to the bed and told the doctors making the routine checks that he thought his patient was dead. On coming over to his cot, DeLong was not responding to any resuscitation attempts. Another doctor who was present later expressed shock at how just an hour earlier the patient was seen very stable with no symptoms of any sort, but on entering his room later they found him not breathing at all. Swango later contacted DeLong's family to inform them of his passing and managed to reach his wife over the phone. Upon arrival at the hospital, he told the family in the presence of another doctor that DeLong's passing was due to a heart attack. But an autopsy was not conducted yet, so how was he so sure it was due to that? DeLong's wife also said she had made a written request for an autopsy to be carried out, but the coroner's office later stated they had no record of her request. It wasn't until about 18 months later, following a thorough investigation, that DeLong's body was dug up. The coroner discovered a clump of medical tape in DeLong's windpipe. It was then that the cause of death on the death certificate was changed to indicate homicide. That same year, 2 more deaths at University's medical center were deemed suspicious, and one of these was Rena E. Cooper, a 69-year-old woman who had been admitted to the hospital for low back pain. After she had her supper and medication, she settled into bed that evening, and between 8 and 9 p.m., Swango and a team of doctors made their rounds. But after they left, Carolyn Berry, a nursing student, entered the room and saw Swango standing alone next to Mrs. Cooper's bed. Only minutes after Swango left, the sound of bed rails shaking and Mrs. Cooper's roommate yelling filled the space. Mrs. Cooper's face had turned pale and bluish, and she appeared unable to breathe. Nurse Berry rushed to get help, and soon other nurses and doctors filled the room to initiate a code blue, which was the highest level of emergency in a hospital. When Berry told them she had seen Dr. Swango administering something into Mrs. Cooper's IV, her claim was dismissed by those around her. Arlo Brockle, head of surgery residence at Ohio State, was one of the doctors who had attended to Mrs. Cooper. He later explained her condition and noted the absence of reflexes, which he suspected was caused by a paralyzing drug. Neuromuscular blocking drugs, such as succinylcholine, were commonly used during the 1980s to induce muscle paralysis for medical procedures. These drugs, however, also paralyze the muscles required for breathing, meaning that mechanical ventilation is necessary when they are administered. It is highly likely that Swango administered a dose of succinylcholine or a similar paralytic agent to Mrs. Cooper. The drug would have acted rapidly, causing muscle paralysis and leaving her unable to breathe. The eerie calm that preceded her distress clearly showed the deadly intent of the man in the white coat, standing by her bed, one who was trusted to save lives, not end them. When the hospital looked further into the issue, they discovered that Mrs. Cooper's IV tube was indeed filled with either Anactine or curare. Both are commonly used anesthetics and can be fatal if given alone. To prevent reactions like those experienced by Mrs. Cooper, both medications are frequently administered together. This would have been clear evidence to build a case against Dr. Swango, but the hospital chose to turn a blind eye, and he found an avenue to go scot-free. Upon Mrs. Cooper's release from the hospital, her discharge paper read that the belief of someone tampering with her IV was nothing but a paranoid delusion. But Dr. Swango's continued stay in the hospital would only lead to more chaos, because after the investigation, 2 other suspicious yet less popular scenarios took place. In February, he was to accompany Surgeon Gary Birkin on a visit to Evelyn Perini, who was recuperating from colon surgery. It is still uncertain if Swango was ever left alone with the patient. But 45 minutes later, Dr. Birkin was called to Evelyn's bedside, where, to his utter shock, he discovered she was bleeding severely and without clear cause from various parts of her body, including her eyes and nose. Birkin later mentioned that these symptoms were only seen in patients who had been poisoned.
Murder has become like an addiction to Swango. He has the same kind of compulsion for murder that drug addicts do for drugs. His craving, so to speak, is getting greater and greater.
In the autumn of 1991, Swango was employed by Dr. Anthony Salem, who oversaw the residence program at the University of South Dakota in Sioux Falls. Swango had undergone a rigorous hiring process involving interviews with multiple doctors. Despite some red flags, like his poor results in obstetrics and gynecology, nothing in Swango's paperwork seemed sufficiently alarming to disqualify him from the position. Once again, he had expertly fabricated a compelling story about his qualifications and achievements, which Dr. Salem found convincing enough not to dig deeper. Yet, in the back of his mind, Dr. Salem harbored a nagging suspicion that he might be taking a very big risk. That suspicion was confirmed just months later, on the day before Thanksgiving. On that Saturday night, a cable TV show in South Dakota aired an excerpt from an episode of 2020 ABC's News Magazine program, which featured a segment on the Quincy poisonings linked to Dr. Swango. Within 5 minutes of the episode airing, Dr. Salem received a frantic phone call from a concerned hospital staff member who recognized Swango on TV. It was clear that something sinister was at play. That show was only the beginning of the end for Swango at Sioux Falls, but the most devastating blow would come in his personal life. The weight of his deception and the growing suspicion surrounding him eventually took a toll on his fiancée, Kristen Kinney, and her tragic death on the morning of July 15, 1993, would later be linked to the man she once loved, a man whose life was defined by a terrifying blend of charm and despair in his wake. At midnight, Dr. Salem, using the hospital's email system, fired Swango and immediately revoked his pharmacy privileges. After sending the email, he returned home in the early hours of the morning, still unsettled. But once he got home, he tuned into a repeat broadcast of that TV show, and as he watched, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. He realized that the doubts gnawing at him and the concerns raised by his colleague in Quincy were not baseless. The narrative he had been fed that Swango was the victim of a miscarriage of justice was a carefully crafted lie. The conviction in his mind solidified as the truth became undeniable. Michael Swango was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. At 9 a.m. the next day, Sunday, Salem phoned Swango and requested his presence at his office later that day. There, he replayed the video and asked him if he had ever been indicted at Ohio State, but Swango denied any knowledge of it. What surprised Salem most was that under such circumstances, anyone would panic, but in Swango's case, he remained unnervingly calm and very convincing in his demeanor. But the truth was all on television. While meeting with Swango and his fiancée, Dr. Salem was stunned by how Kristen Kinney reacted to the revelations, and later learned she had told friends she was unaware of the Swango's dealings in Quincy or at Ohio State. Despite this, Kristen supported her boyfriend, and they relocated to Portsmouth, Virginia, together. Sharon Cooper, Kristen's mother, and Al Cooper, her stepfather, were confused by the sudden turn of events in the supposed bright future of their son-in-law to be. Al remembered he had heard the news in South Dakota, and his wife suggested going to get Kristen, but Kristen got upset at the idea. He said that they were concerned about her, but they had to respected their privacy. Upon the couple's arrival back home, the Coopers showed even greater worry for their daughter's welfare. At 26, Kristen had always been described as a kind and warm person by her mom, but upon her return, she had become isolated and seemed changed from how she used to be. Mrs. Cooper grew increasingly worried as Kristen began suffering from severe headaches and bouts of vomiting. She initially dismissed it as stress, but the symptoms continued. Kristen's rapid decline left her parents in despair, unable to fully comprehend the extent of the darkness that had enveloped their daughter's life. Then on June 1st, 1993, Swango was approved for a psychiatry residency at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, so he relocated to Long Island. But Kristen remained, and as her mother observed, she wasn't wearing her engagement ring anymore. All these led up to July 15th, when her body was discovered in a Newport News park. It was reported she apparently died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to her chest. A few meters to her body was her vehicle, with a suicide note inside that stated that she was finally at peace. Many people are astounded at how simple it looked for Swango to continue killing, despite concerns. However, physicians are held in high regard in American culture, and hospital deaths are not uncommon. When you combine that with his ability to inject poisonous dosages of difficult-to-track drugs, you see how easy it was for him to escape being discovered. His smooth people skills and calm demeanor disarmed those around him. Swango was convincing, often appearing as just another doctor doing his job, which made it all the more challenging for colleagues and supervisors to suspect, let alone prove, his sinister actions. But for how long would he keep running away from the eye of the law? In June 1993, after causing numerous unexplained deaths and being investigated in the Midwest, he went to New York to begin a psychiatric residency program at Stony Brook University Medical School through the State University of New York. Swango once more falsified a lot of important information on his application, and during the interview he repeated the made-up story about his felony conviction being a result of a barroom fight, a pretty far cry from his crimes of attempted murder from poisoning his colleagues. He went as far as showing a fake Virginia pardon to add more evidence of his innocence. Swango's charm and intelligence left a strong impression on Dr. Alan Miller, the head of the psychiatric department. His con was so convincing that nobody felt the need to fully check his qualifications or look into his background. Swango was appointed and set to start his responsibilities on July 1st, 1993. Nevertheless, his time at Stony Brook University resulted in the deaths of a lot of patients. Within hours of Swango taking over his case, Dominic Buffalino, a 60-year-old man with mild pneumonia, tragically passed away from heart failure on his first evening under Swango's care. In the following months, 3 additional patients, Aldo Seren, Thomas Samaco, and George Ciano, all died under very mysterious conditions. They were brought in for minor issues, but both died unexpectedly due to heart failure. Dr. Miller could not overlook this increasing number of deaths. Teresa, Buffalino's widow, strongly believed that something was amiss and suspected the new doctor was involved in her husband's demise. The mounting suspicions of Swango's questionable methods left Dr. Miller into conducting an inquiry into Swango's practices. And before the thorough investigation were concluded, Swango had absconded from the country. In 1994, he had moved to Africa, where rules were less strict and background checks were typically non-existent. Swango obtained a position as a physician at Meneni Lutheran Mission Hospital in Zimbabwe, once more lying about his qualifications. One Deacon Mapofu from the local church met him at the small Bulawayo airport and drove him to the mission station in Meneni to meet Dr. Christopher Giri, the director. Giri, known for being direct, questioned why a dynamic city doctor would choose to work in the uninteresting village of Menene for a pittance of his usual income. Swango only faked his expression of love for Africa and his desire to provide assistance to the black people who lacked the same opportunities he had. On arrival at the facility, the hospital staff were extremely happy to welcome a seemingly skilled young American doctor to their village. The Zimbabwean villagers considered themselves extremely fortunate to have the man, as such a gesture was uncommon in many parts of Africa. Had they been aware, they would have realized that his coming would lead to the people of Menen sobbing uncontrollably in the months to come. Soon, the same pattern of mysterious occurrences began. Patients who had previously been in a stable condition started dying mysteriously while under his supervision. The local hospital staff, who were already busy and overworked, struggled to no avail in monitoring these strange occurrences. Nevertheless, further cases of suspicious deaths raised the eyebrows of Zimbabwean officials who launched an inquiry into the matter. On seeing this, Swango fled once more and left the entire community in severe sorrow over several bereaved families. Swango spent almost 3 years evading capture, moving between different countries. It was only in 1997, during his attempted return to the US, that authorities eventually apprehended him. He was arrested at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport on June 27, 1997. Where he was trying to travel to another medical job in Saudi Arabia. His passport had been marked by the FBI, and they were positioned at the gate, ready to apprehend him. Arresting him was a big win for the police, though the case was still ongoing. The authorities now faced the challenging job of linking him to the many deaths that had happened while he was serving in multiple states. The FBI, in partnership with local law enforcement agencies, started resolving the mysteries by reviewing patient records, hospital logs, and speaking with many witnesses. The initial trial centered around his fraudulent behavior, particularly his falsification of documents to obtain medical jobs. Swango was found guilty of wire fraud in July 1998 and given a 3.5-year prison sentence. However, authorities were aware that these accusations were just the tip of the iceberg. He was much more guilty than that.
But investigators know that the time is really ticking, because I think he was only sentenced for like 2 years. He was only going to be doing 2 years behind bars for fraud, because that's not I mean, it's a serious crime. I don't want to feel like it's not a serious crime. It's a serious crime, and you should not commit fraud.
Yeah.
But it's not, a lifetime imprisonment. So they really had the clock working against them.
But building a solid murder case against Swango was not an easy venture. Many of his victims had pre-existing severe medical conditions, which made it challenging to prove that he deliberately caused their deaths. Moreover, Swango's skill in evading detection by constantly switching between hospitals and even countries resulted in evidence being spread out across various jurisdictions. Yet, getting on the good side of numerous medical professionals was easy for him. So some still doubted he was even capable of committing the kind of murders he was being accused of. However, the case only started to take shape after the Zimbabwean government presented evidence of the deaths that happened under his supervision. As more victims began to identify with the case, the investigation grew more intense, with authorities working tirelessly to link Swango to the deaths. Interviews with patients who survived, as well as with colleagues and families of those who passed away, uncovered a disturbing trend of unexpected complications and sudden deaths. By the year 2000, the US government had gathered enough evidence against Swango and charged him for multiple murder cases. The courtroom was packed with heartfelt stories from families of victims, a lot of whom had not recovered from the suspicious demise of their family members. During the proceedings, Swango maintained a calm composure and did not display any remorse at all for his actions. In September 2000, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole after admitting to committing multiple murders to escape the death penalty. However, his situation has not been forgotten or lost to memory. He has had a quiet stay in prison, but he still maintains his infamous reputation. His situation is often referenced in medical ethics debates, and investigations into other questionable deaths linked to him are still ongoing. There are those who think that Swango may have actually harmed more than 60 people, even though he has never confessed to the complete scope of his wrongdoing. It's pretty clear that for a lot of people like Swango, their terrifying legacies will definitely be remembered and used as a warning to others who may want to toe that lane. In any case, if you'd like to see more of these videos, like this video and subscribe. Also, see you in the next video.